When Palworld released in January of 2024, it completely took over the gaming world for a brief moment of time. Even if you had no interest at all in the survival genre, it was impossible to not at least be a little bit curious about Palworld's absurd premise of Pokémon with guns. Speaking as a die-hard Pokémon fan myself, I had no choice but to dip my toe into the game when it released last year. I remember enjoying what I played, but a couple of hours in, my wooden base was burned to the ground by a horde of fire Pokemon, pals, and I immediately put the game down out of frustration and didn't plan on ever returning. However, I picked it up again recently due to its PS5 release and wanting a low-stakes game to mess around with, and 20 hours later, I think I might be kind of addicted to this ridiculous game. This was certainly not something I was anticipating, but I've been pleasantly surprised at just how much fun Palworld actually is. And again, speaking as an avid Pokemon fan, there is so much here that this game seems to understand about the Pokemon formula that recent games in that series just don't. Sure, the, let's call it inspiration it takes from Pokemon is pretty shameless, but it gets what makes Pokemon great and executes on it in a pretty impressive fashion, especially for a game technically still in early access. So today I want to talk about what makes Palworld so damn fun and why the Pokemon Company should be taking notes here. And no, I don't mean litigious notes. Please, no more lawsuits, guys. Before we get into the video though, I just want to say thanks for watching, and if you do enjoy this content, please be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Got a ton of support and engagement on my last video, and that stuff really means the world to me. Alright, now let's get into things. Talking about Palworld in 2025 feels like I'm a little late to the party. Like I said, this game was everywhere when it launched last January, and now, about a year later, it feels like you don't hear about the title at all, unless it's in regard to Nintendo and the Pokemon Company suing the shit out of it. But like I said, Palworld is technically still in early access. I hope that means it has a long life ahead of it, because even if the public fervor around it has quieted in recent months, there is still a lot of fun to be had here. As most people probably know by now, Palworld is a survival game that has the player exploring a vast world, building a base, collecting resources and using them to craft equipment and other items, and all the many other staples that the survival genre is known for. But what sets Palworld apart is its pals, and how they fit into the equation. And that's what I want to talk about today. These pals might just look like blatant Pokemon ripoffs at first glance, but the more I played, the more I wish that modern Pokemon video games operated more like this game does. I'm not saying the next Pokemon title needs to suddenly pivot to the survival genre or anything like that, but Palworld seems to understand some of the concepts that make Pokemon great in a way that more recent Pokemon games don't get at all. I know this might sound blasphemous to some, but let me explain. Some of my fondest memories of my time with the Pokemon series involve the feeling of overcoming seemingly insurmountable odds with my team of Pokemon. If you're of a certain age, you probably remember that first time you faced Whitney in Pokemon Gold or Silver and getting rollouted to death by that damn Miltank. I remember facing her repeatedly as a kid, ramming my head against the wall over and over again, determined to defeat her. 8-year-old me was not the most strategic battler at the time, but after countless losses, even my dumbass eventually realized I had to go level up my Pokemon a bit more and stock up on items to finally take her down. It took what felt like forever for me to finally get past her, but that feeling I got hours of grinding and tens of potions later when I finally emerged victorious was unmatched. And it felt like I was truly bonded with my Croconaw afterwards. My little gator Pokemon might have just been a collection of pixels on the screen, but for 8-year-old me, it felt like I went to war with that little dude, and it meant a lot. Maybe part of it is how much older I am now, but this sort of challenge and feeling of overcoming the odds has been mostly absent from the core Pokemon games for years. Most of Sword and Shield and Scarlet and Violet are mind-numbingly easy, and while there might be slight difficulty spikes at moments, there's really nothing that compares to early series battles like Whitney or Red or Cynthia. Palworld, on the other hand, is not afraid to kick your ass. The game's map is pretty damn impressive in size and scope, but I've spent most of my 20 hours largely confined to some of the starting islands, as most of the time I've attempted to venture further out and capture some of the stronger pals, I get immediately wiped. This leads to me having to trek all the way back after respawning to collect my lost items, which is a real pain in the ass, that adds legitimate stakes to dying in this game. So what does all this have to do with my earlier point about Whitney and her Miltank? Well, when you do start to overcome these obstacles and challenges that Palworld throws at you, it feels awesome. It took me ages to finally level up enough and gather the resources to craft myself some metal armor and a musket, but once I did, it felt like I was ready to take on anything. And sure enough, armed with better weapons and equipment, I was able to slowly start venturing out deeper into the game's islands and felt very much like a badass as I did. I know some of you might be rolling your eyes and thinking this is fairly basic survival game stuff, and yeah, it is. But it's also very reminiscent of that feeling of triumph I mentioned earlier when talking about finally beating Whitney. Venturing deeper into the land of Palworld and wiping out pals and enemies that had given me hell in my earlier hours gave me the same feeling I used to get in the early Pokemon games when I was stuck against a tough gym leader only to come back after a couple of hours of level grinding and then wipe the floor with them. And that feeling I mentioned earlier of finally defeating Whitney and feeling forever bonded with my Croconaw for helping me do it, well, that's here as well. I wasn't able to overcome these challenges solely due to my metal armor and musket. I also have my trusty Eevee, Nox, by my side. Like many other pals, he might be a pretty shameless Pokemon imitation, but his dark-type moves were a godsend for me as I explored the islands of Palworld, and much like I did with my Croconaw all those years ago, I started to feel legitimately bonded with this adorable little creature. Palworld's creature designs might pale in comparison to Pokemon, but the game's challenges greatly help with endearing the pals to you, and when so many modern Pokemon games have been utterly devoid of challenges like this, it's hard for them to have the same effect. The concept of bonding with your team of pals expands much deeper than this though, and it's thanks to one of the other key pillars of Palworld, base building. Working alongside your pals to complete tasks is deeply satisfying and again creates bonds with your virtual partners that feel more and more satisfying the longer you play. I'll talk more about this in a minute, but first let's talk a little bit more about the recent Pokemon games. For years, myself and many other fans have been clamoring for more ways to interact with our Pokemon in the mainline games. Remember Pokemon contests? Introduced in Gen 3, this feature wasn't perfect, or really even all that fleshed out to be honest, but it was another way for us to interact with our team of Pokemon outside of the traditional battle mechanics the games are based around. Around that time, we also got the ribbon system, which allowed us to earn ribbons for our Pokemon by completing certain milestones. This was an even more bare-bone feature than contests, but hell, I still liked it a lot. It allowed more customization amongst your team, and again felt like another way to interact with your Pokemon and for them to feel just a little bit more special. Having a Zangoose decked out in ribbons made your Zangoose feel just slightly different from one you might find in the wild. That Zangoose had his own story in some small sense. But of course, Game Freak scaled back on these features, and in Gen 9, ribbons feel like an afterthought, and contests are long extinct. My point here is that Pokemon games need other ways for you to interact with your Pokemon besides just battling with them over and over and over again. Otherwise, they just feel like static images on your screen. Some of them might look really cool, sure, but that's about it. Scarlet and Violet, I guess, tried to make an effort here by allowing you to make sandwiches and eat them with your Pokemon, but it's an incredibly lame and shallow gimmick that gives you virtually no incentive to interact with it. I think maybe I touched it once during my time with Pokemon Violet, and maybe I'm speaking out of term and there are some big time Pokemon sandwich minigame lovers out there, and if so, good for you. But for me, this was really not what I was hoping for when I asked for more ways to interact with my Pokemon. Palworld though, once again, excels here. Base building is a key component in Palworld, and while it might seem like a relatively simple system compared to other games in its genre, it still offers a delightfully addictive gameplay loop once it gets its hooks in you. Building a base and then populating that base with machines and tools to produce resources to build more stuff is hardly a revolutionary concept, but the pals element here is really what helps sets it apart. There is something deeply satisfying about watching your pals walk around the base throughout the day, working on all sorts of different tasks to help keep the base running. The game does a great job at making all pals feel like unique individuals in this regard as well. For example, I had my little Firefox Fennekin ripoff pal constantly creating ingots in the forge, a task that obviously any of my water type pals would be unable to perform. Again, this is all pretty straightforward stuff. but it's such a clever way to get more mileage out of the pals mechanic. Catching, raising, and battling with pals is obviously a huge part of the experience, but having the second equally substantial pillar of being able to work alongside them in your base does wonders for making these pals feel like the center of the experience and creates organic gameplay stories as you play. For example, my fat Tauros-inspired pal was constantly slacking off and not getting any of his tasks done until I built him a hot spring to relax in. Now he gets his work done, but I swear he's the only pal I ever see using that damn hot spring. Again, this gives him a little bit of personality. Another example is that nothing warms my heart more than when I'm slaving away crafting something on my workbench, only to see one of my trusty pals come running across the room to help me speed up the work. This stuff sounds so minor, but it goes such a long way. In Pokemon, you don't get any of this. In the modern games, your Pokemon are solely vessels for battling. There are no other activities to partake in with them, no other ways to engage with them, and no way to make these virtual creatures feel important. Unless you want to make and eat a sandwich with them, I guess. Can't forget that. I'm not saying that the next generation of Pokemon games needs to have some base building or survival mechanics, but can we please at least get some other ways to interact with the Pokemon? It doesn't have to be nearly as robust as what Palworld provides here, but come on, we need something. Something that doesn't involve sandwiches. Anyway, Palworld is not by any means perfect. It can be janky as hell, its gameplay loop can get pretty repetitive, and you're bound to run into your fair share of bugs when you play. But when you look at the full package, there's no denying the game's addictive qualities. Like I said though, for me, my favorite part has been what I was most skeptical about going in: the pals. Despite mostly looking like generic versions of their Pokemon brethren, Palworld elevates its pals by giving you tons of challenges to overcome with them and plenty of ways to interact with them. As someone who has been mostly disappointed with the last couple of mainline Pokemon games, this was a breath of fresh air. Hopefully Game Freak and the Pokemon Company take notes, because for my money, Palworld is the best Pokemon game that we've gotten in years. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you like Palworld? Have you given it a shot? Are you as unsatisfied with the most recent Pokemon games as I am? I'd love to hear from you. And as always, thanks for watching.